Hello, everybody. Welcome to Writer's Block and my class, The How of Creativity. I'm super excited to be able to share this with you. I've been teaching this class many times, and I just think it's fun to be able to talk about how creativity happens in creating all the stories and books that I have. This picture on the slide is not a picture of me. I am not a fighter pilot, but we'll be talking about a very interesting fighter pilot because a lot of the principles came from him, and I'm excited to be able to talk about it. The author who probably inspired me the most was Terry Brooks, and in his memoir, Sometimes the Magic Works, he talks about creativity, but he really kind of dances around it, almost like he's afraid to talk about it. Like if he pulls the curtain back too much, even for himself, that he's going to, like, the magic's going to dry up, and then he's not going to be able to come up with the fantasy stories that he liked to tell. What I found is the opposite is to be true, that the more you pull back the curtain on how creativity works, the more that that muscle, that engine produces for you. So hopefully some of this advice will be useful to you. So let's get started. It is probably true quite generally that in the history of human thinking, the most fruitful developments frequently take place at those points where two different lines of thought meet. Now, I read this quote reading a biography of Sir Isaac Newton earlier this year, in doing research for a new fantasy series that I'm started writing. Werner Heisenberg is the guy who invented the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So if you know anything about subatomic particles or the quantum realm, you know, Ant-Man, they trace a lot of their ideas to this guy about the quantum realm and how that stuff works. But when I read this quote in this biography on Newton, I loved it because it captures, to me, the most fundamental principle of creativity, the intersection, or the idea where two different ideas from two different points come together and meet. So let's talk about some of these principles that we're going to learn from him and from some of the books that I've read. Here's 5 different books that got a principle or two of creativity from all of these. And I'm just going to share some of the highlights. Some are writers, some are pilots, fighter pilot aces, the CEO of Intel, the CEO of Pixar. Lots of different ideas come from a lot of different sources. And so I want to share some of these principles with you. The first one comes from John Boyd. He was in the Air Force and was the guy who taught at the Top Gun of the Air Force at Nellis Air Force Base in New Mexico. I learned about him while I was working at Intel. So he was the guy who taught other fighter pilots how to stay alive during aerial combat. In fact, he came up with this idea called the OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And this basically the system where if you're flying a fighter jet and you see another airplane, you observe what they're doing, you orient with what you think their next move is going to be, you make your decision about what you're going to do to counter it, and then you go ahead and act. And basically the principle is whoever can go through the 4 steps of the cycle the fastest as the pilot who's going to win the dogfight. So, we're not talking about this because of, Maverick, Top Gun. We're talking about it because, and again, not because of fighter pilots, but because he came up with ideas of creativity. In fact, not only did he come up with this, he came up with other principles that ended up being incorporated into jet fighter design that's still being used today. In fact, some of his principles of aerial combat is applied to the theory of war that is happening even in Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's principles that are actually happening today. This OODA loop is still going on, being one of them. One of the things he would do in his classes that he would teach a class on creativity at the Pentagon. And he actually wrote an essay in 1976 called Destruction and Creation. And in this essay, he talked about the principles of analysis versus synthesis. And he defined it like this. He says, analysis is breaking something down to its individual components or interactions. And then synthesis is taking various and unrelated components and putting them together into something new. The case study he would use in his classes was this. He would show 4 different pictures, not these pictures. I just pulled these off the internet, actually. But the concept was, downhill skiing, boating, riding a bike, or having and owning a tank. And so what he would ask his class to do is he'd take these 4 different ideas, these 4 different concepts, and then he would have them break them down into all their kind of their parts. So, okay, if you take skiing, for example, what goes into skiing? Well, you've got your skis, you've got your winter suit, you've got your goggles, you got your poles, you got your downhill momentum. Okay, if you're boating, okay, you've got your motor, you've got maybe a tube you're pulling your kids, or you've got your steering wheel, anybody. So that's analysis, breaking something down to its individual components. Then what he would do is he would have his class, try to assemble pieces of these different parts together and create something new. And he was looking for something specific, but he was just seeing if the class could do it. Now, we don't have time to do that right now, but what he would come up with by pulling some of these constituent parts together, he would create a snowmobile. Like he'd use the handlebars from the bike and the tread from the tank, the ski from the downhill skiing, the motor from the boat. Just one piece from each could come together and invent something new. Now, snowmobiling is very popular where I live today. I actually have a snowmobile. And so they're super fun. But again, by pulling together the different pieces, assembling them into a new and interesting way, you could create something new. And that's what we're doing as authors, really. We are trying to create something new out of the parts that we have of stories and different things that we pull together. Another author who's great at this, in fact, I don't know if you know the history of the story behind how Suzanne Collins came up with the idea for the Hunger Games. I actually found this in an interview that was done with her, which I think captures this point really well. She says, one night I was lying in bed and I was channel surfing between reality TV programs and actual war coverage. On one channel, there's a group of young people competing for, I don't even know. And on the next, there's a group of young people fighting in an actual war. I was really tired and the lines between these stories started to blur in a very unsettling way. And that's the moment when Katniss's story came to me. So again, channel surfing between 2 different shows, reality TV and war footage, just going back and forth. Suddenly, boom, the idea for the Hunger Games came. And then, of course, you had the work of, doing the world building and all the stuff that happens next. But isn't it interesting that sometimes the littlest of ideas can turn into something that has been made into movies and best-selling novels and things like that. So I love that story that she has told. And I have found a lot of my ideas have come sometimes even through a single line or a paragraph or an idea I got watching a movie, watching a TV show, something else. And I always try to capture those ideas. In fact, I think it's so important that we protect those little ideas. In fact, one of my favorite quotes comes from the Roman philosopher Ovid, and he wrote, "A new idea is delicate. It can be killed by a sneer or a yawn. It can be stabbed to death by a quip and worried to death by the frown on the right man's brow." And I think that's really important that when those new ideas come, you have to nurture them. You have to take them. You have to protect them. They're not ready for an audience yet. But when those new ideas come, don't just toss them out. That's a dumb idea. No, sometimes just save it, protect it, nurture it. And you never know that seedling, what it's going to grow into.